Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm William Grimes, the director of the Center for the Study of Asia, and we're sponsoring this event. We appreciate your coming here on a gloomy Monday, the day after Thanksgiving vacation, to hear what I think is going to be a very extraordinary story of the secret memoirs of Zhao Ziyang, who was one of the, from our point of view, often one of the heroes of the Tiananmen incident. I'm going to just say a couple of words about the center, and then I will turn it over to my colleague Shelley Hawkes to give proper introductions to our very distinguished speakers, Mr. Ignatius and Mr. Bao Pu, who are the two of the editors and translators of this very important work. The BU Center for the Study of Asia puts on a lot of events during the year. Some of you may be on our mailing list, and I hope that you find things that you enjoy. If you're not on our mailing list, please, by all means, sign up. I want to mention one other quick thing before I turn it over to Shelley Hawkes, which is that we are a center for the study of Asia, not just China, not just East Asia. We cover the whole range from Turkey all the way to Japan, and we have many different events of different sorts, from musical performances to art gallery exhibits to academic talks to cultural shows. And we hope that you'll be involved in coming to hear or see all of them. The last little bit of business is that we will have books available for purchase of prisoners of the state, and Mr. Ignatius and Mr. Bao have very graciously agreed to sign as many of them as are bought or brought to them. So I encourage you to do this at the end, not yet, because first we have a very wonderful event for all of you. Now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Professor Shelley Hawkes, a China historian and a senior lecturer at the College of General Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So we are thrilled to welcome the editors, Bao Pu and Ignatius, whose collaboration with Renee Chang brought about the publication in English of the secret journal of China's late premier, Zhao Ziyang. And the book's short title is Prisoner of the State. And this will be available for sale right after the question and answer session in the lobby here. Now, it was published by Simon & Schuster earlier this year in time to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 1989 demonstrations in Tiananmen Square and the subsequent crackdown led to Premier Zhao's dismissal and arrest. And Zhao opposed the decision by the paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, to order a military crackdown. And in his final years, according to his memoirs, Zhao became an advocate for democracy in China. And in those memoirs, he candidly comments on disagreements among the top leaders. And he also recounts his own thought process during the early to mid-1980s as he steered China toward the household responsibility system in agriculture and toward an export-driven economy centered on China's coast. And the depth of his reflections really testify to the significance of Zhao as a politician and a strategic thinker. And these memoirs will probably persuade historians that Zhao was the key person who figured out conceptually how to make economic reform work for China. Of course, Deng Xiaoping's support for Zhao's approach made it all possible. So now let me provide some background on tonight's speakers. Bao Pu is a political commentator and a human rights activist, and he and his wife, Renee Chang, are the publishers of New Century Press in Hong Kong. And Bao Pu's residency in Hong Kong affords him some immunity from state censorship. And this is Bao Pu's first university appearance in the United States to discuss the book project. Bao Pu is the son of Bao Tong, a high-ranking party member and senior aide to Premier Zhao. In 1989, Bao Tong, his father, supported Zhao in opposing Deng Xiaoping's decision to crack down, and as punishment, Bao Tong was jailed for 7 years. Thus, the fulfillment of this book project represents in one sense a tribute to Bao Pu's father, and we congratulate him on seeing through this important addition to the historical record. Now, Ignatius is currently editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review, and last year, another book he edited called President Obama, The Path to the White House, made the New York Times bestseller list, as has Prisoner of the State. He has a distinguished list of professional accomplishments in editing and journalism, and I'll describe a sampling. As deputy managing editor of Time magazine, he oversaw and wrote articles for the special issues, like the Person of the Year issue on Vladimir Putin in 2007. And while serving as the Beijing bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal from 1987 to 1990, it was his coverage of Tiananmen events of 1989 that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. He speaks Russian and Chinese, and I learned that he first studied Chinese here at Boston University in 1978. He told me that he was taking a year off from Haverford College and was preparing to go to China, and he took Chinese via a night class here at BU. So we welcome Ignatius, too. And then finally, our moderator is our own Joe Fewsmith, Professor of International Relations, and he's also Director of East Asian Studies, the major here at BU. And Joe is the definitive authority on Chinese elite politics, and he's written many books and scholarly articles, and his most recent one is called China Since Tiananmen, and it was published in 2001, but he's revised it recently. So I'll hand you over to Joe Fewsmith.
My role here right now is just to say thank you for coming. I'll come up. They thought that I could handle the questions because I've been in a classroom. So I will call on people and try to keep some order later on. But right now, I would like to welcome your presentations. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Ignatius, and I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the background of how this book came to be and what my role in it was. And then Baopu, who is the true hero of our story, will talk in more detail about the content of it all, what it says about China of that era, what it says about China today, and then we can get a discussion going. You know, I'm going to assume that people that they aren't intimately familiar with Zhao Ziyang and his history. And for some of you, this will be, you know this, but some of you don't. I just want to kind of get everybody to the same place. So Zhao was the premier of China. He became premier in the 80s. He had a track record in the provinces, in Guangdong especially, of pioneering some of the economic reforms which really got the Chinese economy moving after the sort of Mao era. And he was elevated to Beijing at a very early age. He actually told a story, which I wrote an introduction to the book, and I included this, but it's sort of indicative of the high regard with which China's elite viewed Zhao when he was still a relative unknown in the provinces. During the Cultural Revolution, like many other people like Zhao, he and his family were sent to the countryside, were working in a factory in Hunan province, living in a tiny little apartment. I think they used their suitcase as their dining room table. I mean, they really sort of had nothing. He just completely fallen from grace. Again, a familiar Cultural Revolution story. And then suddenly, after several years in the political wilderness, in the middle of the night, the factory party secretary knocked on his door and said, "Get dressed quickly, we're going to the airport." So the airport, I guess, was the provincial airport, many, many miles away. The only transportation the factory had was one of those little motorcycles with a sidecar. So Zhao put on the best clothes he had at that point, jumped in the sidecar, and the motorcycle took him to the airport. They then put him on a plane. Nobody explained what in the world was going on. He's just, okay. He gets to Beijing. They check him into the Beijing Hotel, which is one of the nicer hotels at that time. This is late Cultural Revolution. He couldn't sleep because it was the first time he'd been lying down in a comfortable bed in many years. In the morning, a limousine appears at the hotel, takes him, he still doesn't know where he's going, takes him to Zhongnanhai, where he meets with Premier Zhou Enlai. So Zhao really has no idea what's going on. He sort of prepares himself. He's getting ready to meet Zhou. He says, he's starting the speech. We know I've reflected on the Cultural Revolution, I think. And Zhou cut him off and said, forget all that stuff. He said, we wanted you back here. You're going to be a senior party official in Inner Mongolia province. So basically, he was brought back from the wilderness. They recognized this was a guy of value to developing China as it came out of the kind of Cultural Revolution craziness. Later, Zhao was told that the person who was responsible for his coming back was Mao himself. And the story that Zhao told, and that Zhao was told, was that, Mao, and this rings true if you've sort of read about Mao in his late years, he sort of, suddenly bolted upright from a nap and asked his aide, where's Zhao? And he was told, well, everyone, they got purged, these guys. And Mao's reaction was something like, wait a minute, we weren't supposed to purge everybody, get him back here. And that started this sort of crazy chain of events with the motorcycle and the plane and the limo, and finally sort of Zhao's return to central politics in China. So this is a guy who from a young age was clearly intelligent, was extremely pragmatic, not at all burdened by any ideology. He really was a pragmatist first, and had been successful in the provinces, was brought in the 80s as premier, and then eventually, and this was arguably his downfall, was kicked upstairs to become, or was elevated to become the party general secretary. And we can talk some more in detail about that later. But so let's fast forward then to 1989, and the Tiananmen demonstrations are happening. It's a confusing time. The party isn't sure how to react. There's clearly division within the party that even amateurs like myself who were in Beijing were aware of. There were conflicting lines. There were conflicting messages. At a certain point, we realized that the demonstrations had moved from becoming, or that what was at stake at China was not merely demonstrations that needed to be either co-opted or suppressed, but that there was a power struggle at the highest levels that needed to be resolved. And at a certain point, I think the demonstrators became pawns in that struggle. So on May 17th, 1989, there was the meeting at Deng Xiaoping's house that was sort of the turning point moment. I'm skipping lots of detail before then. The Tiananmen demonstration started in late April. As most of you know, triggered, at least ostensibly, by the death of Hu Yaobang, who had been the party general secretary before Zhao, was viewed by students as a relatively sympathetic figure, a relatively kind of human figure, not an ideologue, and he was treated very badly when he was removed from power. And so when he died, the demonstration started, and then became this catalyst for protests about, certainly not just Hu Yaobang, but about everything from the lack of democracy in China, the lack of transparency in government, corruption throughout the system, et cetera, et cetera. And there were millions of people in the street at their peak. So on May 17th then, a month into these demonstrations that the party can't figure out how to control, there's the meeting at Deng Xiaoping's house where the decision is made to bring in the army to suppress the demonstrations. And that was Zhao's last attempt. Zhao was the most gentle, the most liberal voice in the sort of the highest echelons of the party, who was arguing that there could be a peaceful solution, that we can sort of respond in a way that shows we're listening to these complaints. We can co-opt the demonstrators, basically, and we don't need to bring in the army. And Zhao made that pitch on May 17th. A couple of party elders got up after that, absolutely shot him down. Zhao realized that this was all pre-cooked. A decision had been made before he even entered the room that the military would be brought in, and that his advocacy for a gentler approach had no hope. And Zhao realized at that point that his political career was finished as well. Shortly after that, he went to Tiananmen Square, a really famous kind of defining moment, and probably the moment for which Zhao is most well known. He went to Tiananmen Square. There's a famous picture of him holding a bullhorn, talking to a group of students, really tearfully apologizing that things had gotten out of control, telling the students, we've come too late, hoping that his sincerity would translate into, a sense of understanding among the student leaders, and that they realize, he couldn't say, it would have been treason, I suppose, to say martial law has been declared secretly. He couldn't say anything like that, but he was trying to communicate that this has reached a new and serious level, and I think hoped that the protest would somehow die down or morph into something else. Anyway, it was too late, and the students, didn't necessarily trust him any more than they would have anyone else who had shown up. But that was really the last moment that Zhao was seen in public. It was really the last moment he was seen in public, other than rare glimpses, sort of many years later at a golf course here or walking down the street there. But so basically, Zhao Ziyang was the man who tried to stop the army from moving in on the students at Tiananmen Square. He basically, after this, was out of power, was not part of the high-level meetings. After the crackdown on June 4th, he sort of became under a more formal house arrest, and he remained under house arrest from 1989 until his death in 2005. Now, it had always been assumed by people who cared about China and cared about this period, rather poignantly, it was sad that Zhao had apparently never left a memoir, had never kind of written out at any length his account of events, never had a chance to give his final say on what had happened, to kind of defend his view, to show that there might have been an alternative to the military crackdown that happened on June 3rd and 4th, 1989. Well, obviously, we're here because it turned out he did leave that memoir. Until this book was published earlier this year, no one knew that. It was a project that was kept in full secrecy, and we can talk more about that later too. But Zhao, probably mostly around the years 2000, 2001, 2002, secretly recorded about 30 hours of audio tape. He was under tight house arrest. In his book, he talks about the entrance to his home being I think he says, a cold and desolate place. But inside, he was actually doing something that the authorities had no idea about, and that was really leaving his memoir for history. His assumption clearly was that if authorities found out, they would stop it, they would confiscate everything. So he recorded these 30 cassettes. His family contends that they were unaware that this was happening until all of them were recorded and smuggled out of the country. Zhao made sort of minimal notations on the tapes. He numbered them, but there was no other titles or notes. In one of the passages and these tapes, needless to say, make up the book, Prisoner of the State. But in one of the passages about Tiananmen, he talks about leaving a historical record. It's one of the only signs in his speech, in his memoir, where he's making it clear that he would like this to be a public document. So he entrusted a few friends. Some of the earliest tapes, there are other voices, and he's talking about events with some friends, and we can talk about who those are in a sec. But most of the tapes are just Zhao sitting alone, clearly reading from a prepared text. It's very kind of organized, very logical, very kind of finished material. And when he was finished, he shared copies of the cassettes with a few trusted friends, and themselves high-ranking officials who had served in China when he was premier and party secretary. And they managed, sometimes through family members, to get the tapes. They were given partial batches of tapes, apparently to hedge against confiscation. And all these tapes were successfully smuggled out to Hong Kong. Zhao kept a copy, which were sort of hidden in plain sight among his grandchildren's toys in his home. So there's an interesting, very kind of subtle little game he was playing, again, without involving his family, but just assuming that his friends would start a process that would lead to the publication of a book like this. So let me just talk quickly about my role. So maybe a year before publication, Baopu and his wife Renee, came to my house in New York and said that they had these 30 hours of tapes and wanted to turn it into a book. And it was just this incredible secret and this incredible development. And I was flattered and thrilled that, Baopu had been asked to sort of collate these. I think the Zhao family trusted him. The other people involved trusted him. Obviously, his father's relationship with Zhao. I mean, his father was really Zhao's top aide, and his father paid for that with 7 years in real jail, as Zhao was going through 16 years of house arrest. So they both paid dearly for taking the wrong political line at Tiananmen. So Baopu, as I said, was the hero of this story. I mean, he collated all this material. He and Renee translated all this material. They had to, bring the family along, bring the other stakeholders, namely the other people who were involved in getting the tapes out of China to Hong Kong, just making sure everyone was on board that this would be published. Because, the potential risks should be obvious. I mean, Zhao's family, his children are, several are still in China, are doing business in China. While we were working on this project, Baopu and I communicated back and forth through heavy-duty encrypted email. And our assumption was that if the Chinese authorities in Beijing knew about this, they would squeeze the Zhao family members and just say, we don't know what your role is with this project, but we know you can stop it, or you know the consequences. And I think it would have been probably very difficult for the family to resist that kind of pressure. Our calculation was that if we could get this all the way through to publication, that once the book was out, it would be difficult for the Chinese, if they were inclined to do so, to actually punish people in such a way. It would be so transparent that they would not do so. So far so good. As we were talking about this just now, as far as we know, there's been no retribution of any kind since this publication. So there was another question of timing. This book came out shortly before the 20th anniversary of June 4th, but it was the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen demonstration, and we felt very strongly that anniversaries on one level are meaningless. Who cares? The 20th anniversary, the 18th anniversary. But the fact is, people do focus, and there are symposiums because it's the 20th, and there are articles in places like Time Magazine because it's the 20th. So these numbers have some magic and are, if nothing else, wonderful excuses for us to sort of pay attention to important events of history because there's a nice round number like 20. So Baopu and I really hustled, and Renee really hustled to get this into shape for publication on time, and it did come out, really right at the sweet spot, I guess, in May of this year, and really, became kind of the most interesting new development as the world was suddenly focusing back on China, thinking back on Tiananmen, looking for lessons 20 years later. I had worked for Time Magazine actually when we started this project and until December. So, we worked it out where Time Magazine broke the story. We had, then immediate coverage in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, elsewhere, and then it sort of took on this life of its own. We were thrilled and flattered that it made the New York Times bestseller list. To me, more interestingly and more importantly, is it clearly has a reading audience in China. It clearly has a reading audience in Hong Kong, where Baopu and Renee's New Century Publishing, which I think it's fair to say was created in large part many years ago with the hope that one day this book would come to fruition and Baopu and Renee would have a publishing house to publish this book. They sold, last count, 200,000 copies in Hong Kong? 100,000. That's a journalistic thing. We exaggerate. 400,000. Okay, 100,000. That's a lot of copies. This is just in Hong Kong alone. 100,000 copies. The Hong Kong audience, Hong Kong people are really into politics. it's a place where many newspapers, still sell successfully, where there are political magazines that people are engaged with, and where political books like this are important. But also, clearly, a lot of people are buying copies and taking them back to the mainland. And a Chinese version of the book was scanned, I guess a PDF version was scanned in and loaded up on some server and available for download by anybody who cared throughout China. So I think there's no doubt that people who care about this, who care about these topics, have had access to a Chinese language version throughout China, even though a book like this could not possibly be sold overtly in China. And that to me is important. It just, to me, I guess I feel, in my personal life, if I die tomorrow, I've done a good thing by being involved in this, and I'm ever grateful to Baopu for bringing me in on this. I think what this book says, among other things, is there could have been another way in 1989. That the official line is that. And I would guess many, and I have a sense that many young Chinese sort of buy this, because why not? The official line is that there were demonstrations on the street, there were hundreds of thousands of people, they had taken over the most sacred spot in China, arguably, the Tiananmen Square. They wouldn't leave despite pleas from the government, despite what the government probably would describe as concessions that they made. They wouldn't leave. What government wouldn't do the same thing? At a certain point, you bring in the military. And that's a fairly persuasive argument, and I would bet a lot of Chinese basically accept that. And here, 20 years later, there's a reminder that this did not have to happen, that at the very highest levels, Zhao was nominally the highest ranking official in China. There was another approach. He believed and argued persuasively that there was another approach, a peaceful approach, and that it was really internal politics that were exacerbating the situation, that were preventing a kind of a sensible resolution of the issue, and were ratcheting it up into an inevitable confrontation that, I think that's important, number one. I think another important thing is, in his conclusion, Zhao talks about, his idea for China's future, that what China needs is a sort of Western-style democratic system, a parliamentary democracy. And, I think readers in the U.S. might think, yeah, okay, whatever. That's actually pretty extraordinary for somebody who had been a lifelong Communist Party official, who knew only that, who, until the end did well by that, who could alternately have argued that, the communist system was proper for China, but there were mistakes made by individuals. But he didn't end up there. He really argued in the last chapter of the book that China really needed to change its political system, that it could not continue to grow, that it could not be successful ultimately without that. And so what's interesting to me is, those ideas suppressed after his death are now part of the dialogue as the Chinese figure out, what kind of future they want, political future, economic future. Zhao's ideas are part of that discussion instead of suppressed as they had been before. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Baopu for more details, and we'll take questions later. Thanks.
I guess I'll cut the small talks. Let's focus on the content. Why this book is important? This book is, I think, the reason that we're still talking about it, that there are people, still reading this, is because, Zhao covered a period of time, and during this time, that the Chinese leader were engaged in a debate. The debate is about what the post-Mao China is going to be, and whether you like it or not, whether you was born in China, or if you're, even if you have nothing to do with China, our life, in the past 20 years has changed, and that change has something to do with that debate. That debate has something to do with the change. And I think that is the reason that debate and the process of the debate and what was at stake during that debate and the outcome of that debate is still important. And that is why that the Zhao's book is important. It's about it's about China that we know, and it's also it revealed a lot about what China. It actually gave us some kind of tool and some kind of insight knowledge about how to view China today and its future. And I think that's the most important reason that this book is still relevant. The debate that I was talking about, it was a debate among the Chinese leaders after Mao died, and all of a sudden there is a political chance that actually presented itself. Obviously at that point everybody knows that that China's future is at stake, and if they continue Mao's policy, there will be no future. And that is the reason why that all these Chinese leaders are generally agree that China needs to go through this reform process. But the problem is that nobody knows where reform is going to be, what the direction of reform was going to be, and there was confusion, and the missing context of this book about that period of history is that during this debate there was generally two fractions. One is Zhao and Deng and all those people who supported economic reform, and the other fraction being the bureaucracy and led by Chen Yun and all these factions that think the Soviet-style economy was still a good model for China. The missing context is that these two sides, who's more powerful? Chen Yun's side is actually more powerful, and because they had a powerful argument. One is that since the Soviet Union using that model and becomes a superpower, and why can't China do the same thing? And Chen Yun argues that if the only problem that went wrong in Mao's era was because they didn't. There was a problem of proportionality. They didn't assign appropriate that there is a disproportionate allocation in the economy so that the model didn't work. And also there is one important reason is during Mao's era, Mao's social campaigns was actually aimed at training its bureaucracy to accept Mao's idea of revolution, and his idea and his and because of that, Mao wants a communist China in his own way, but the rest of his bureaucracy resisted and passively resisted. Even they couldn't actually go against Mao politically, and Mao was furious about this, and that is the reason that Mao wages all these campaigns, and to aim at to get rid of his political opponent, and to train his bureaucracy, to tame his bureaucracy, and he never trusted them. So by the end of 1976, when Mao died, the whole bureaucracy was sufficiently trained to fear the idea of a market. And the bureaucracy was basically, people who in the structure viewed market as a dangerous factor because it will bring into it will endanger them politically if they support it. So with these powerful forces, on top of that, this group also had this theoretical base, which is, by definition, they are communists, and they're supposed to building a socialist economy. So there's no, in theory, there's no reason that for the reform that will undo Mao's policy. And Zhao, in the very beginning, and Deng, nobody, had idea like how this reform should go. And on Zhao's side, on those people who's pro market reform, the only thing they know is that by experience in the past, whenever they introduce anything that has market elements in there, it's got a good results, whether it's in agriculture or in other area of economy. So they and also when they started doing this, one powerful help come is the real results. Once they relax a little bit on certain sector, and there is immediately there is a huge good results, and this will kept them actually going. And of course, politically, there was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping happens to be a person that has no, he doesn't care about ism, at all. Whatever, he believes that that the economy should actually be freed, but he has no idea, where, he just doesn't trust, that the Mao's model of economy works. So he's supporting whoever tries, whatever means to undo, what Mao had done, and this is basically the landscape of the Chinese high politics in the 80s is these two camps, and I would say their debate was in fact legitimate because they were facing a problem how to do reform. They obviously should have different opinions. It's all normal that people have different ideas of where the reform should be. But the fact that all these reforms, all this debate had to take a form of this political undercurrent, the so-called power struggle, was because the way that the Communist Party works, the party seeks total 统一思想, which is the unification of the thoughts, and so they're not supposed to having different opinion, and therefore the debate was taking form of a kind of a devious and kind of undercurrent, and I think this is what Zhao actually described in detail. This actually knowing all these details would actually help us to picture, to basically finally complete the picture of what the real problem was. The real problem was that there is one issue divide the Chinese leaders is China should go through should transform its economy into market economy or not. And I think that this is also it actually provides a kind of a model for the scholar during the 80s, to study China. They kind of adapt this model of a power struggle. But the power struggle, what's missing, in this model was that the rationale of the different parties in the model. If you fit in, if the scholar have known all the motives of the different leaders, then the model would be much more complete and accurate, and it actually could be more useful. Because each person on a different camp is not because of their personality or the form of a power struggle. And power struggle, I think, is misleading because it suggests that the purpose for them to suggest to be to advocate certain position was because for the desire of acquiring more power. And I think that's kind of misleading. There is a legitimate reason that they take their position. And also each person who's taking position in their camp, their roles, has something to do with their past. And the reason that Deng Xiaoping is Deng Xiaoping because in 1958, he was basically put in charge of this anti-rightist campaign. And because of that, he, in the reform era, he doesn't want to basically say that all the anti-rightist campaign was wrong. And so he retained part of, he wanted to be consistent, and he does not want to admit, 1958 was all wrong. So he left. So basically, he gave this legacy, to the Communist Party, that that the party should seek total control of opinion, and would have the domination of this, intellectual domain. In China. And Deng Xiaoping had an inclination of strengthening one-party rule has something to do with his past. But also he was criticized by Mao for his economic policy. It also gives you an idea that why he actually supported reform. And there's this brand of this group of communist, senior communist cadres, from Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and Zhao Ziyang, Hu Yaobang, and all these people had some basically from their working experience that they just know, and there was no. Like whenever the market, elements was introduced, they will have good results, and that's purely from instinct and experience. But that was the only thing that actually kept them going. They're thinking, oh, maybe we should expand, market, elements, even further. And Zhao was the one person that actually conceptualized clearly in his mind that the China's economic reform is market economy, and there is no third way. And I think that's important in 1980s, during that process, and because his early realization, he was able to push the reform process towards that goal. And in the book, he articulated, how he has done it, what the secret was. and also the other character, Li Xiannian, who actually opposed reform. Opposed reform, he was coming from the background of he was in charge of economy during the Cultural Revolution years. And everything that Zhao had done during the economic reform process, it was viewed by Li as undoing what he had done before, as a implicit criticism of his past. So he's obviously taking a position of he's prone to taking a position of being sort of conservative. So all these are the kind of missing context of this book. If you piece them together, you have a complete picture of what was at stake in this high politics circle in China. And also, it's not just in my view, it was a kind of interesting and legitimate debate among them. It wasn't even because of a pure personality conflict and all these leaders. And the fact that it's taking a form of a power struggle was due to the Communist Party's culture. There is one important issue that I thought it was very, very important to mention here is that Zhao, how did he become a supporter of Western democracy from a communist leader? Did he actually change his fundamental belief? And how did it happen? And I think the answer is, I don't think he has in the late years, he decided his life that actually before he lived was all wrong, that he was served on wrong side. He changed his fundamental belief, but rather that he realized that that what the final destination or the final goal of a political reform should be nothing but democracy. It's consistently with what he argued before, that there is a need for political reform. The reason that he's arguing of political reform is related to his just imagine he's the only one probably have a clear concept of this economic reform process, and the end result would be market economy among all these senior Chinese leaders. And of course the book articulated like how he actually made that happen. So he also he was also the early ones in the process among the Chinese leaders who realized that this type of economic reform has its consequences and its costs. There's a cost associated with this kind of process, and that is the social injustice that actually brought in by the process, systemic. That actually because of the process, there is this rising social injustice. What he meant was that if we continue, if the party continues to go to push economic reform to financial services, to real estate, to the use of land, these kind of important sectors, then there is a problem of quickly the power will actually marrying with money in his own term. would have then there is a rising social injustice. This is the problem. So his way of dealing with these kind of problem is political reform. So in his early political reform idea, he contemplated the idea of having the workers' union, to be able to fought, for workers' rights, and he contemplated, for academic freedom and maybe a free press, and all these ideas, but because of the condition, and also because it was early on, the process had just began. He didn't realize that that process, once you start it, there is no third way, and the end result, would be democracy. And I think what he realized in his late years after 1989, after he's out of this power circle, he realized that the political reform has no other destination except democracy. If you want to, if the purpose was actually properly address these social injustice problems. So I think it's his new revelation, but he was on the same track of what he was thinking, and also there is no when he pointed out that Western parliamentary democracy, there is a kind of the reason that he used this term so specifically was because democracy is a word being hijacked everywhere in the world, and he's trying to point out he's making a practical choice of Western parliamentary democracy was actually proven it's working in most of in all its industrialized country. So why not China? It's not even an ideological choice. He said, it's proving it's working, and why not? And but there's a there's a difficulty to get there, and he showed, quite convincingly, in the book, that how to get there. And I think I should end here.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your very interesting talks here, as well as for your efforts in bringing this into English, and Ed, Renee, who played a major role in the translation of this. This is, for those of you who have not read this, you should. Should you take my IR 585 course next semester, you will read it. Be the first book that we start off with. I've had the pleasure of reading it in both Chinese and in English. It's really worth reading in either or both languages. One of the things which comes out, political scientists are always thinking in terms of institutions, systems, pressures. When you're at Zhao's level, it's all about personalities. And it reminds me that after the Tiananmen crackdown, when Deng Xiaoping went out and introduced Jiang Zemin as the new general secretary of the party, I think this was May 31st, he said, I talked to Chen Yun and Li Xiannian about it. We're okay with it. I mean, I talked to two other people. That's the party's decision. It's a different type of system, and you get so much of that flavor in this book. There's simply nothing like it in the whole Chinese literature in modern Chinese history. It reminds you of Khrushchev Remembers. It's the only thing like that. So I'm sure that there are lots of questions that people have formulated while you're listening to these talks, and Baopu and Adi have graciously agreed to respond to these, and I'll play traffic cop. Yes, sir. Would you like to start us off? If you would wait for the microphone and identify yourself, we'd appreciate that. Thank you.
My name is John Stachel. I'm Professor Emeritus of Physics and Director of the Center for Einstein Studies here at Boston University. I want to start out by saying I sympathize very much personally with Mr. Bao, because my father was also a political prisoner in this country. As a leader of the Communist Party, he was imprisoned under the Smith Act, only for 3 years and 8 months, not for 7 years, but still he was imprisoned. I just say that to remind people that political prisoners is not a monopoly of China. And I think even in this country today, if we look at the so-called war on terror, if you look closely enough, you're going to see there are a lot of political prisoners under that rubric too. And we should not forget what Thomas Jefferson said: eternal vigilance is the price of liberty in this country. It's just as much as it is in China. But the main point I want to get to is the question of political democracy. It seems to me political democracy is, yes, very important, but it does not solve the problem. And what I'm talking about here is the importance of independent and active free trade union movement. It seems to me that whether you believe in capitalism or socialism as the ultimate goal, it is a fact that capitalism functions best when there is a strong, independent trade union movement exerting countervailing power and pressures towards equality, a lessening of the gap between the highest and the lowest in the society. And this is just a historical fact. Capitalism in the United States, for example, I think functioned best between the 50s and the 70s when the trade union movement was strongest. And myself, having grown up in the 1930s, I remember what a great role the growth of the trade union movement played in the success of the New Deal coalition. And one of the things that worries me most about this country today is the fact that we don't seem to have that kind of strong trade union movement exerting pressure on the Obama administration, for example. Now, I have had some small experience in China. I visited Beijing once and Hong Kong once, and I also tried to follow the trade union situation as reported by that trade union group in Hong Kong that reports. And I have my understanding is that there is still no free trade union movement in China. Whenever the beginnings of such a movement come about, two courses are followed: either try to co-opt the leadership, and if that doesn't work, try to suppress the leadership by prison or other, what we would call here, extra-legal means. And it seems to me that political democracy alone will not solve that problem. For example, we have political democracy in the United States today, but attacks on the trade union movement and working-class organization go on unhindered, and the attempts to pass, for example, legislation favorable to a free trade union movement in this country are stymied in the Congress. So I wonder whether Zhang was aware of this problem, and is that reflected at all in his thinking that political democracy might be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a healthy and active countervailing power to these tendencies which you so eloquently discussed towards what I would call the powers of monopoly capitalist forces in this country and in China. Okay. And aside from that, do you yourself have any opinion about this issue?
Thank you very much. Is Baopu? I got that signal.
Trade union is not going to replace a form of government, and whatever trade union does is different from how the government should organize itself and what are the guiding principles of a government. Trade union is important. I think Zhao actually contemplated in the early period of a political reform that he thinks China should really have trade union and really should have allow the workers to fight their own rights, and the union should actually lobby on behalf of the worker. And the real situation on the ground is that in China there is no trade union. So unlike if you compare the trade union condition in different countries, and I think in communist China, ironically, it's in the worst position because it doesn't even exist. The so-called union are basically a branch of a Chinese Communist Party branch. And I think this is far from what you think is ideal. And I think Zhao did think it should include this as he did consider in the early political reform package that he proposed. What you said as a trade union is contradict to liberal democracy. I think it's debatable. I don't think the liberal democracy would necessarily in direct conflict with trade union idea.
No, I said liberal democracy was a necessary but not sufficient condition for true democracy.
Yeah, that might be true.
Somebody else? Do we have another comment? Chong-Hong?
Hi, my name is Chen Long. I have 3 questions here. First is that
Keep them brief.
in this endeavor of writing this book, what happened to you guys? I mean, we didn't see retribution to Zhao's family, but for you two, were you on the blacklist of denying visas to China? And my second question is, in part of this this taping, if I remember correct, Zhao gave himself some credit in this economic reform, which is quite different from previous conception, Chinese conception, which believe Deng was backstage making the policy, and Zhao was the one to carry them out. But in this tape recording, Zhao, I think, made it clear that he was actually also not only the facilitator, but actually the ones who planned out this economic change. How much do you give the Zhao's credit in this economic reform? And the third question is, for Zhao, in his later period of his life, he kind of democracy. But what I want to ask is, since he was prisoned and under house arrest and never got a chance to experience the Western, democratic practices, does it, diminish his, credibility of, promoting this kind of democracy? I mean, what about his own, is his own understanding of democracy accountable? Thank you.
All right. Well, so the first question about repercussions and whether we've faced anything. I was supposed to be in China, actually with so I'm now working at Harvard Business Review, and every 2 years, all of our the editors of all our international editions get together somewhere in the world, and it turned out we had decided to get together in China, and it was going to be just at the publication date. So at the very last minute, I canceled that. I didn't think anything would happen to me. I thought it would be embarrassing for our Chinese hosts, who might, I don't know, have get in trouble somehow or be embarrassed somehow. So I canceled my trip. I have not tried to go back since then. Baopu's situation is different. He can talk about that in a second. Rod McFarker, who is a sinologist at Harvard University, was also one of the few people who was, kind of in the inner circle, keeping the secret as we were bringing this book out. And in fact, he wrote one of the introductions to the English language version of the book. Anyway, he has traveled to China since then and faced no difficulties at all. So, what doesn't actually get into your second point, but the official Chinese response has been brilliant. There's been almost nothing. I think in the past, Beijing has often overreacted to things, tried to deny their veracity in ways that were not credible. have taken small problems and made them big problems by overreacting to them. In this case, I have to credit the Beijing government. This was not flattering to them. It called into question, in some ways, the foundation of the current leadership, or raised questions about it. Raised difficult questions of all kinds, and they just decided to really not engage with it. And one of the only issues that has been debated, though, and I think indirectly, Baopu can add to this if I'm not right, is the question that you mentioned second, which is, does this book, does the foreign coverage of the book make Zhao to be the hero of economic reforms at the expense of Deng? And that I'll hand that off to Baopu in a second, but that is a very sensitive topic. In a sense, I don't want to overstate it, but the legitimacy of the current leadership in some ways owes itself to Deng. I mean, what's interesting, yes, this is a book about Chinese politics in the 80s. It was a different era. There was Deng Xiaoping who acted almost, emperor-like above the political system. There's no one, in an equivalent role. On the other hand, China today is not so different, at least in terms of the fundamental questions we've been talking about. What Deng stood for was, let's do whatever we can to push the development of the economy, but there will not be fundamental political freedom. There will not be anything that challenges the authority of the Communist Party. Well, that is the fundamental issue in my mind running through that entire book, and it is I think the fundamental sort of political question still in China. So the legitimacy of Deng and his legacy is important. One, because that's what he stood for. Two, because he kind of put in place the generations of leadership that still matters today. So Zhao certainly does not say in the book, "It was me, not Deng, who was responsible for economic reforms." On the other hand, nor does he do the sort of standard, Deng was the guy, it was all Deng, Deng is brilliant. Deng. He describes things, I think, apparently credibly. You get the sense that Zhao was an innovator. You get the sense more than that Zhao had to fight the battles, that Deng wasn't necessarily fighting on behalf of Zhao to push economic reform policies through. Rather, he relied on Zhao to fight very difficult political battles against the elders, against the conservatives, some of which Zhao prevailed in, some of which he lost in. But that, in some ways, was Zhao's biggest legacy, not just the innovations he introduced in the provinces and in Beijing, but in navigating this political minefield. And for that, he surely deserves credit.
I think what he didn't do in this book is to give himself credit. He did. If you read the text, you will notice, that he tried very hard to only lay out facts, what happened, and who said what, and who did what, and he rarely actually making comments. So if you think he's giving himself credit, I think that's wrong, because he didn't give himself a credit. He just told you what happened, and if you think he doesn't deserve what we Rodman Falker, actually, who wrote this foreword of the book, saying that it looks to him that Deng Xiaoping was the godfather of the reform and Zhao would be the architect, and that's his own assessment. You can well be disagree and arrive your own conclusion, and I think that's fine. And I think there's nothing wrong with it. So what's striking in this book particularly was that he's trying hard to not leave any kind of personal view or comment on things. He's giving the facts. He's trying to tell you what happened, and I think he did well on this. As a political, when politicians writing memoirs, they're famous, for telling lies, and but this one, I think, set some kind of standard. in stick with the fact and the facts only. And in fact, in many occasions, he understated things just because, he was a Chinese politician. And the third point, the third question is whether, if he didn't live through, if he didn't, live, in a democratic, environment, how does that diminish, his credibility for calling for democracy? I think, the idea and conviction, and understanding of idea and also conviction, has nothing to do with whether you should, live through democracy or not. None of the founding fathers had lived through democracy when they called for democracy, when they designed, the structure. And I think that's really, irrelevant. None of these people. Do you think, that they live under, I mean, the fact that the founding fathers of this country did not live in this democracy, did not experience it directly. Does that diminish their power in calling for democracy? I think that's just less relevant here. I personally, right now, I'm in the process of applying for my visa, to go to China, but I was told it's going to be a difficult process. So I'm still waiting. They didn't say no, but it looks like it's going to be a different process, a kind of difficult process.
They cannot say no for a long time.
Right.
I spent a lot of time watching Zhao Ziyang from afar, and it's fairly obvious. It's very obvious as an outside observer's point of view that his contributions to economic reform were tremendous. He was the guy that was soliciting all the ideas from the various think tanks in Beijing, but you shouldn't diminish Deng Xiaoping's role either. Deng Xiaoping, whether you call him a godfather or whatever, he certainly was the paramount leader. And if he hadn't said, "I support you," none of what Zhao was thinking about would have ever happened. So I think they both deserve a great deal of credit. I was just wondering if I could be a little provocative, take that same question about the response in China and say, is it possible that the reason the Chinese government has not reacted harshly is because nobody cares anymore? I'm putting that deliberately provocatively, but when I've been in China over the summer and this fall, I've asked my friends, who's talking about this book? And there's curiosity. People read it, but it doesn't seem to stimulate any great discussions. The discussions that I remember from the 80s and the 90s just seem irrelevant to many people at this point. And so let me put it starkly and provocatively.
We can put in the test, if a irrelevant topic, if you come out, in the Western news, for example, will it go through this Chinese censorship, this news blackout? Number one, if they hadn't, if nobody cares, I think there will be no need, for censorship, right? And the fact that this book, when it come out, that despite there's a Chinese news blackout, and there is this firewall, and you can never actually get through the firewall if you just search on Google, and the fact that so many Chinese people had learned this instantly, and also the book sold 100 copies in Hong Kong. Who's buying it?
100,000.
100,000. I'm sure there's. You can imagine, how many of them were sold in Hong Kong and how many of them were brought to mainland China. And I think this is what we see. And of course, we didn't see there's a fierce debate, open debate Does that mean, that they actually doesn't think about this, or does it mean that they don't want to talk about this openly, where there's no condition exists for them to talk about openly? So which one? And it seems to me it's kind of obvious. And also whether this issue irrelevant or not, it has something to do with the content. And the content, if you judge from the content, it's hugely irrelevant, not only to today, but also to the future. If you understand what China is today, and this will provide some kind of a clue. Of course, this is my own opinion, and people might well be arriving at a different kind of conclusion.
And if I can just add to that quickly, I mean, it depends what your expectations are. I mean, if you assume that this book is going to be read across China and suddenly change the political debate, or of course not. As you said yourself, people are reading it anecdotally. It is spreading throughout China. The large number of sales, 4 million, I think, in Hong Kong. Plus the fact that people are downloading it. It becomes part of the debate. It is there. His ideas are there to be accessed by the people who will think about China's future. And now it's part of the dialogue, and how it plays out, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Some more questions back there? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Yang Li. I was a former student at BU. I heard about this seminar last week at the dinner party. We sort of had some debate over the stability of the society of China versus political democracy. So I was wondering, what do you think of the future of China in terms of political democracy? And also, there's one thing I feel like a bit like sort of pessimistic is now the Chinese government is doing a very good job directing the Chinese people. I mean, get their interest more in the economic side of their life, and less and less people are interested in politics in China, from my personal experience. So what do you think about this, and what do you see the future of the Chinese political democracy?
Who'd like to take that simple question?
What happened in this political future? I think Zhao laid out his idea, and he showed you what at stake. If you want to actually approach this social injustice, rising social injustice, and also systemic in this political reform process. And he said, basically, so long as if you don't do political reform, and if you then the social injustice will continue. And he said one possible destination of that political reform is democracy. Now, he's actually laying out like what he thinks the different stage would be. And he said, the social injustice will continue. And I don't believe, it was coming from a kind of ideological impulse that he said that. He wants to resolve the real problems that he was facing. If the Chinese leaders are interested in resolving these social injustice problems, for example, if you have right now, if you let people trade, the property, but all in the name of the state, the state still own all property, all lands, in China, and what you got is you have a permission to trade for usage, right? And because of that, all kinds of suffering happens because of the people were, using powers to grab, the most profitable land, the most, the best land, that they can utilize. And it is a problem that's happening now. And it's happening as, what Zhao predicted. If you don't resolve these kind of problem, these type of problem will exist. Now, how does that relate it to democracy? Democracy is not something that actually it would instantly translate into good policy. I think you have to believe in the process, and what he's saying that you have to believe in the process and believe that this would be the end of the destination and to get there. And I think it's not because the second part of your question is saying that the Chinese people are not interested in politics. I think the politics is a part of our life, whether you like it, whether you're interested in it or not. The political process continue. I would rather say instead of people are not interested in politics, is that the Chinese elite at currently they basically they have made their choices already. After 1992, the debate was over, and the Chinese elite are basically buying into this. They made their choice. Most of them, gearing towards, believing the economic reform will continue and the market will be market economy will be the future, but also the authoritarian autocracy will stay, and the most of the elite in the past 100 years, the Chinese elite, what they want is wealth and power, and now they seem like they're getting both, and while they're cutting larger share of the economic pie, and it's these people who made their choice, that these social injustice will continue, and they tried to deal with in a piecemeal fashion instead of a systemic and fundamental way. So what the current status of China, I believe, it reflects the elite's choice. And unfortunately, in 1989, the elite seems like, was trying to arguing that democracy may be a better choice. And now, they have made their choices. And all this silence is a choice. And I think, it has something to do, it's not just because of Chinese leaders, and largely because the Chinese elite had made their choices. But so long if they made choices, these social injustices, these social problems will continue. And it's a matter of how much a society can absorb. And in China, I can tell you, people can absorb a lot.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Chan Seke. I'm I'm currently reading a book for my research, for my paper, and I have two questions to ask. The first one is about the reason why Tiananmen student demonstration become really large scale that you guys Zhao Ziyang in the book kind of describe as because of the April 26 remarks that made in the editorial, labeling the students they are anti-party and anti-socialism. Do you think and Zhao Ziyang keep mentioning if Deng Xiaoping didn't make that remark, the student demonstration would end up become really peacefully, not become a massacre. How do you guys judge, or how do you guys agree his interpretation? And the second one is like, Li Pan was the person who published the remark by himself, like without the consent of other Politburo members. And so I think it would be like fair to say he's like one of the person who make the students' demonstration to that large scale, and he would be like the person who made that mistake. But according to the past, like Hu Yaoban and Zhao Ziyang, they have been like get rid of their position because of their mishandling of the student demonstration. Then why, like, how can you guys explain that Li Pan can stay in his position after like he made that mistake for like so many years by like publishing like the editorial and increase the scale of the students' demonstration? Thank you.
So I guess, do you agree that the editorial itself was a major factor in enlarging the size? Adi, you were there at the time.
Yeah, I think you can't deny that the editorial, which was intended to prevent the demonstrations from escalating, I think it was quite clear that the editorial had exactly the opposite effect. I mean, there may be people who were in Beijing here in 1989 who will remember, being on campuses and seeing how the students reacted to that editorial. I mean, this sounds so, it's very odd, if you live in a place like the U.S., to understand the power of, an official party line editorial like this. But certainly at that time, it had huge power. And, the students, by and large, and of course, there were, people who tried to exploit the student demonstrations for other reasons. But just, the students, particularly in the early days, who were demonstrating really thought, they had right on their side. They had China's interests on their side. They were trying to improve society. And for this official editorial to come out, as you say, to label them as counter-revolutionary, as anti-party, was crushing. And but rather than having the effect of intimidating them into non-action, it really, moved them to say, we have to march again. And the images that I'll never forget are, their professors and their deans trying to stop them in tears, assuming that once the party had laid down a line like this, there would be bloodshed immediately. Now there was, but much later. So what Zhao argues, credibly, if not necessarily and persuasively, in my mind, is that if the party had distanced itself from that comment, once it was made, it becomes harder to retract, but not impossible. And Zhao, tried to come up with ways, including, that he would take full responsibility, that there would be a way to isolate Deng. I mean, again, Deng was the emperor, roughly. His name was attached to this line of thinking. To contradict it would be, to be implicitly critical of the highest power in the land. That was unthinkable. That kind of, loss of face, call it whatever, that was unthinkable. On the other hand, Zhao tried to come up with a realistic method in which, he would take responsibility for that editorial and that the party would retract it. Now, can you say for sure that would have solved things? It's impossible to know. That certainly was a flashpoint. You cannot overstate how important that was. And, Zhao convincingly argues it surely was worth the attempt, to try to move away from that hard line, but it never happened.
What was your second question? It was about Li Peng retaining power? Yeah. After making the mistake of publishing that editorial? Yeah. Okay.
I think what...
Go ahead.
Okay. I think what's important, to here is that the April 26th editorial was not Li Peng's view. Was Li Peng published it, but it was Deng Xiaoping's words, and it's a crucial turning point of the event, because the second day the student held a large demonstration, and for the first time in PRC history, that a popular protest was directly against the ruler of China. And I think this has never happened before in PRC history. And I think, and because of that, the bloodshed was almost unavoidable, because once that published, and all Zhao has done to diffuse tensions and try not to try to prevent bloodshed, which he, as a general secretary, he couldn't even do that. So there's no doubt that the April 26th editorial had pushed the event to the eventual tragedy, and there is no doubt in my mind. And also, the mishandling of the student protests by Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang, the so-called mishandling, if you agree, if you think the final outcome was a good one, then he certainly mishandled the situation, because it never the sequence of Zhao's role was in this whole thing was his idea of handling the student protests. It wasn't go through. It wasn't agreed. His idea was not realized by the other parties. So if you agree, killing hundreds, is a good thing, then Zhao did mishandle this. But if you don't agree, then his idea hasn't been tried. He tried to diffuse the tension, and he didn't get this good political backing from Deng Xiaoping, and he couldn't do it.
If your question is why Li Peng stayed in power, the answer is because he was on the right side. The line has always been that they had to take a firm stand against the student demonstrations at that time, and he was on the right side from a political point of view, not a moral point of view. Neil.
My name is Neil Glazer. I'm a student of China here at BU. You're familiar with the Hinton documentary, and which goes into what was happening with the factions among the students. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't think there's probably a slander or libel suit pending to this day. But certainly the theory of that film is that the bloodshed might have been avoided at an earlier point, that a deal could have been made with the students. Somehow face could have been saved on both sides, and we really didn't have to have the bloodshed that we did, except for some, frankly, self-aggrandizing student leaders, at least according to that documentary. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't know if you have any information through your father or otherwise, to what extent Zhao was in touch with the students, what the channels of communication were. Did it happen the way you see it in the documentary?
Mm-hmm. I think Zhao, as a party general secretary, what he's lacking was he had no channel to communicate with the student whatsoever. And even if he did, it wouldn't have much effect. And given what's happening among the students, I think the Communist Party was hugely they were not equipped at the time to deal with spontaneous protests, except to crush them. And I think this is the very nature of the party to begin with. And the reason that the students' protests escalate was because in the very, very beginning it was taken a form of a mourning of Hu Yaobang. And because of what happened in 1976, that the morning of Zhou Enlai, it was first crash and then got revealed, and the case was overturned, made the party hesitate, and I think that's the beginning of this tragedy, And I think, you know, the what I remember very strikingly was when what happened in April 27th, and I had a conversation with my father after the student held this largest protest, and they break the police line. Everybody was happy, and they went to the campus, went back to the campus, were happy, and calling a success. And my conversation with him, he was very, very kind of sad. You know, he told me that, you know, there might be a bloodshed, and almost it was it was going to be very difficult to avoid bloodshed. And I didn't understand that, you know, at all, because I said there's no point of, you know, of even, you know, escalating. The students were happy. And what I didn't understand is a spontaneous protest had taken, you know, a direct conflict with Deng Xiaoping, which is, you know, the biggest political power in China, and that nature of that clash couldn't have been a happy result. I think giving you know, what the you know, political reality was in China, and I think, you know, it turned out exactly like what he predicted. You know, it doesn't matter what the student, you know, had a very, very, very little time to react when that happened, and nobody could, no one was in control in Tiananmen Square, and you know, even if they did, you know, the window of time that passed so quickly, and I think immediately after April 27th, if they retreated, you know, if there is then Zhao would have another chance to convince, okay, persuasion works. And I think that chance just gone, like within probably, you know, 1 or 2 days, and then there's no more room.
Let me just add one thing. You know, the hidden documentary, I mean, some of the student leaders, you know, talk about, I think they have their own sense of responsibility or survivor guilt or whatever. But I think it's worth, you know, remembering what was happening on the square just before the crackdown. You know, by the end of May, early June, a lot of the Beijing students, including the student leaders, had gone back to their campuses. You were still getting an influx of new students from the provinces, but, you know, it was a period. Okay, you know, I was a Wall Street Journal journalist at that point. You know, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of journalists, myself included, actually, you know, finally left Beijing to take a break, to take a vacation after all those weeks of intensity, because by late May, early June, it wasn't very interesting what was happening on the square. You know, I mean, the student numbers had dwindled. It didn't sort of capture the imagination. I'm not minimizing it. It was a complicated situation for the party. There was talk of a new hunger strike. You know, there was a party congress, I guess, coming up in June, and the students were talking about staying. But a lot of the Beijing students had gone back to their campuses. It was a relatively manageable situation. Now, on June 2nd, you know, the government, for reasons that I still don't understand, sent in, you know, a column of unarmed troops from the suburbs who came, you know, jogging into the center of the city, which had the effect, I'm not sure what the goal was exactly, and I'm a little conspiratorial on this one, but it had the effect of bringing all of Beijing back onto the streets again. And the next night they came with live ammunition. They brought all of Beijing onto the streets to put down a rebellion. It didn't exist until all of Beijing was on the streets facing live ammunition. And of course, there was, you know, predictably there was a rebellion in terms of people trying to stop tanks and troops from moving in on the square. the conspiratorial angle would be basically all those unarmed guys were sent on the 2nd to get Beijing out on the street to create the rebellion that was necessary for the party to crack down. That may be too conspiratorial for some people's taste, but that is basically the flow of events, that you had a situation that had dwindled, that was relatively manageable, that suddenly got stirred up again, and then they came in. So talking about whether the students could have made a compromise maybe early on, but I think it's worth thinking what was really happening June 2nd, June 3rd before the tanks moved in.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank both of you for a wonderful, fascinating presentation and discussion. Just terrific to have you. Will you join me in thanking her?